Hello everybody, welcome to my presentation for Scottish Summit. My name is Rob Sewell and we're going to talk today about controlling permissions to Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance using Excel and Azure DevOps. But before we look at the slides, let's build our demo environment. So we'll run some code and this is just going to tell us when our demo environment is ready. As we can see down here at the bottom, we're checking if our Azure SQL Server is available. So we're going to use Azure DevOps and we're going to run a pipeline to deploy our Azure SQL Server. It's just running some Terraform just to make sure that everything is okay. And the first thing we do, because we're in production, is we need to approve our deployment. So yes, please, for Scottish Summit. There we go. We'll approve that. And we'll just make sure that our job starts to run. There we go. Our job is running. So I'm happy that's going to work. So let's go back to our slides. Thank you to our sponsors for supporting this event and enabling it to happen. My name is Rob Sewell. You can find me on Twitter at SQL DBA with beard. I also blog at blog.robsewell.com and I've written a book. I'm lucky enough to be a dual Microsoft MVP. So what's the problem we're going to talk about? I was asked to automate a solution for the ops team to automate permissions control for their Azure SQL Database and their managed instance estate. And because users love it, they also said, we'd really like to use Excel. So let's talk about creating Azure SQL Database users. If we've got our Azure subscription and we've created an Azure SQL instance, we can either have a username and password, just a SQL Server administrator that can create SQL Server users, or we can be connected to a domain, either an Azure AD domain or one federated to our on-prem domain. And those users can create SQL Server users, usernames and passwords, or Azure AD groups and users as contained database users. But we don't want to log in with a username and password, and we don't want to create SQL Server users. So really, we've only got one option. We're going to use an Azure AD admin, and we're going to create Azure AD groups and users as contained database users. As you've seen, we're going to use Terraform with an Azure DevOps pipeline to create our infrastructure, an infrastructure as code pipeline. And we don't want anybody having to do anything manually to our Azure SQL instance. So we're going to have permissions as code as a pipeline. So how do we create an Azure Active Directory contained user? It's very easy. We can just use T-SQL. We can create user, the name and the domain.com from external provider. That's a Azure SQL DB specific syntax. But we can only do that if we are connected with a connection that has been established with an Azure Active Directory account. So we had a list of tasks that we needed to do. we've got to be able to apply our permissions. We've got to use an Azure Active Directory connection. And because we don't want usernames and passwords, we're going to use a service principal, an Azure Active Directory object that will have permissions to run as part of the pipeline. We're going to need to assign our Azure SQL Server identity within Azure Active Directory, have an Active Directory admin for our Azure SQL instance. We're going to have to apply those users directory readers role. We'll need an Azure DevOps pipeline, and because our users want it, we're going to have our permissions controlled by an Excel sheet. Okay, so we've got to be able to log in as our SPN to be an Azure Active Directory connection so that we can run the T-SQL to create a contained user. We're going to use Dba Tools for this. Dba Tools is an open source PowerShell module designed for managing and administrating SQL Server instances. Not all of the commands will work with instances in the cloud or databases in the cloud, but we can run T-SQL. So the first thing we need to do is we need to connect our DBA instance. This is good practice for when we are working with Dba Tools, is we first make a connection to our instance. So we're going to apply the SQL instance name, the database name. We're going to have the SQL credential, which is going to be our Azure SPN client ID and secret. And then we need to add our tenant ID and trust server certificate. Once we've got that connection, and that's what the script in the background is doing, then we're going to be able to run some T-SQL. We provide the connection as our value to the SQL instance, so that this Azure SQL here is this variable there. And then we can give our database, and then we can run our T-SQL. And then at the end, we just disconnect. The T-SQL we're going to use is pretty ordinary. We're going to do a bit of if it exists. Otherwise, we're just going to create a user using the principal name and from external provider. And then we're going to run that with invoke DBA query. Excellent. So our apply permissions done. The next thing we need to do is assign our Azure SQL Server identity. This can be done when we create our Azure SQL Server, either using the assign identity parameter in new AZ SQL Server, or if you're using Terraform, then in the MS SQL Server resource, there is an identity block. It has a type system assigned. That's the only type that's available. So that's how we can apply our SQL Server identity, and that's going to give our Azure SQL instance an object within Azure AD. Next thing to do is to set our Active Directory admin, the user or groups that can apply permissions, can create users. So we've got our, you can do it within the portal. If you go to your Azure SQL instance, there'll be an Active Directory admin. You click on that, and then you can set the admin. Do it with PowerShell using set AZ SQL Server Active Directory Administrator, and then provide the display name and the object ID for the user or group that you wish to apply. Or you can do it within Terraform. In the same resource group, you can apply the Azure AD Administrator block and add in everything that you need. So that's our Active Directory admin. Next up, we need our directory readers role. So this one was a little bit more troublesome. This one within a corporate environment is going to be more difficult. You can do this within the portal. If you go to your Azure Active Directory, we interrupt this session to inform you that the SQL instance is ready. Excellent. Thank you very much. Happened to be just at the right moment in time as well. So we're going to dismiss this and we'll look at how to do this within the portal. First though, I'm going to close that and I'm going to set this command. So the reason I'm doing this is so that we will get notified when our directory reader permissions have synced. So if we don't have an active directory, if we don't have director readers role, then we're going to get this error when we try to create our users. If we look at the error, it says failed during execution. We do not have Azure Active Directory readers permission. Please follow the steps here. And there's a link which will show you that I cannot add the principal. So let's go to the link. And this is going to show us how we can add our Azure Active Directory SQL principal, but also it's going to tell us the permissions that are required to do this. So the permissions that you need to be able to add a user to this directory readers role are quite high and also not on this page, but that's okay. So we're going to go to our Azure Active Directory and we're going to look at our roles and administrators. And we're going to find the directory readers role. And then we're going to add our Beard Elastic SQL Azure SQL Instance. So that's being added. And once it's applied, it takes a few minutes to sync. Then we'll get a notification that we're ready to go. So let's go back to our permission. So you've seen, that was super quick. It normally doesn't work that quickly. So I'm going to leave that one and we'll come back to that at the end of the the slides. So to add a user or a group into the directory readers role, the script has to be done by an Azure AD global administrator or a privileged roles administrator. And as you can tell by the names of those roles, most corporate organizations don't want to give that to some bearded consultant who's come in to do this work for them. So you will find that you have to go through the process that you need to be able to get those sort of people to do this. Now in Preview, you can actually assign the directory readers role to a group. So if you create a group, get a group created in Azure AD, maybe Beard SQL instances, and then you can give the group an owner. So maybe that could be me, and then apply the role to that group. And then whenever I create an Azure SQL instance, I can just put the instance into that group, and then the role will be granted. So we've got our directory readers role completed. Next up, we need an Azure DevOps pipeline. Okay, so here is my Azure DevOps pipeline. It's pretty cool. So we start off by checking out our repository. And then because we're using a hosted agent, one thing I need to be able to do is to read from my Azure Key Vault to get the values for my SPN's client ID in secret. But we're using a hosted agent and we need to be able to go through the firewall. You can use the download of all the IP addresses it's going to use. That's not always going to work. It's also a very large number. It's hard to maintain. So what I do is I get the IP address of the hosted agent and then I just add it to my Key Vault firewall and to my Azure SQL server so I can connect and apply the permissions. Then I deploy my permissions and remove the firewall rules. This is what it looks like. So my pipelines are kept in code in YAML, and they're going to trigger when the branch includes main and when the path includes permissions. That's where the Excel sheet is going to be staying. Then we set up some variables. This is how we get the client IP and use Azure AZCLI to add the network rule. The same for the Azure SQL Server. And then we just run the deploy permissions PowerShell script, which is going to use import Excel to read the Excel file and then use Dba Tools to apply the permissions. What we do at the end is we always run our firewall rules delete. This was an important process that I had to go through with the security team. We were talking about this, was I had to show them that this condition always means that no matter what happens to the steps above, we will always remove the firewall rules for those hosted agent IPs from both the SQL Server and from the Azure Key Vault. So there's our Azure DevOps pipeline. Next up, we need our permissions in an Excel sheet because that's what our user wants. So we're going to have a worksheet that has the instances and the databases and the roles with a description, because we had custom roles. We had custom roles just here. So these are all the default roles for the demo, but we had plenty of custom roles that we applied down the bottom with some descriptions. So the users in the future would know which roles to apply to which users. On the next worksheet, we gave the SQL instance as a drop-down. So column A was validated against the SQL instance on the previous worksheet. We added our principal. And yes, we would normally add Active Directory groups, or Azure Active Directory groups. I've used usernames, so you can see we can do a fair bit. And then I had a admin column. So these users are going to be admins on the Azure SQL instance. Now, this means that they're assigned the DB manager and the login manager role in the master DB. So we create a contained database user in master DB, which enables them to be able to control permissions within the database. Although, as you'll see, it's not quite as simple as that. And then we had our permissions. So we've got our SQL instance, we've got our database, again, validated from the front sheet. We've got our principals, and then we've got the role that we wish to apply to them. We save that Excel sheet. We push it up to our remote repository. We create a PR for authentication, auditing, approval purposes. And then we're done. So once that PR has been approved and we're happy for our users to have those permissions or have those changed to permissions granted, then we can just run our automatically run our DevOps pipeline. And that's going to run all of the code. And as you can see, it's going to display I'm adding these users to the database. And even better, we're also going to show that we're going to remove users. So if the script finds a user on the SQL Instance database that isn't in the Excel sheet, then it's going to drop them. It's also going to drop them from the role. So here we can see that if we find a user in a role that's not in the Excel sheet, then we're going to remove that user as well. So we've got everything we need. Our users can use an Excel file in a source-controlled repository. So we did have to do a little bit of work with teaching these users how to use source control. But these people were used to working in IT. They were a business unit, but they were used to IT. So with a good set of instructions, they were able to pick it up really quickly. We created with Terraform our Azure SQL Instance with its AAD identity. We've got an SPN, which we have to have granted the directory reader's role in Azure Active Directory. If you can get a group created, that's just a case of moving it into a group. Otherwise, you might find there's some process there. Whose Dba Tools is going to run within our pipeline to run our query. I haven't really gone into Key Vault. Key Vault is just storing our secrets. So we just use PowerShell to go and get the secrets out of our Key Vault and use them within our code. And everything runs in Azure DevOps. I'll put this slide up now so that you can get it. You can get the details of how to get in touch with me. If you have any questions, I love to talk about this. Please feel free to get in touch with me. And here is my thank you slide. Thank you very much. But let's go and have a look at it in action, actually see something working. So now that we have added our user, what we're going to do is prove that we can connect to our instance. So let's open Azure Data Studio. Azure Data Studio, here is our master database. We're connected as our SQL admin user, and we've got some databases here. We've got our system databases, and in the master database, we've got our Azure DevOps SPN, and we've got my account because those were created by that PowerShell. So if I connect with my account, Azure Active Directory, then if I open up the databases, I can run a query. So this is the query. I'm going to add John Morehouse as an admin. We're going to connect to master as me. Do that connection. Now I can run this code and I can't do that. I'm not allowed, even though I've got the login manager role, to be able to add people to be audited. To be audited to the master database so that they can change permissions. I can, of course, do this with the SPN. So in my PowerShell code, we go and get our secrets out of our Key Vault, and we create a instance connection with Dba Tools, and then I can run this code. And that's going to create Joey in the Beard Audit database. So I can add those permissions, and it's made sure that I'm added as well. Come back to here, and I have a look in which database was it again? It was the Beard Audit database. You're looking at the Beard Audit database. Oh, no, I can't look in there because even though I am DB manager and login manager, I can't read this database. I can apply permissions, but I can't read it. Okay, Rob, so let's apply permissions to a user in a user database. So remember, here was our code to create a user. We just need to use create user and from external provider, and then I can add them to a role. So let's connect to a database. We'll connect to Beard app 1. To connect to that, but I can't do that either. Hang on, Rob. Didn't you just say that if you were in DB Manager and Login Manager, that you could apply permissions? Yes, I absolutely did say that. What I didn't tell you was the caveat. And the caveat was that the databases that we are trying to add permissions to must have been created by a user who is in the DBO. So it must be created by one of the people that are in a DB manager role. They must be DBO. This instance is created, let's do that up there, is created from Azure repos, Terraform, Elastic Pool, is created using this code. And what this code is doing is getting some variables. And also, there's our SQL Server creation, some firewall rules, and then we create the databases. So each of these databases are created by the Terraform. So they're created by the service principal user. Service principal user is not in the DB manager role. That's why I can't apply permissions to this. You can imagine the DB8 team were like, yeah, well, that's a bit tricky. We want to be able to apply permissions, all of this. I'm like, no, we're source controlling and automating our permissions. So the permissions can be applied with Excel. Only takes a couple of minutes. Okay, well, how do we do that? Let's have a look. If we go to our Excel sheet within our repository, Terraform, Elastic Pool, permissions, here's our Excel sheet. Open up our Excel sheet and you can see that it looks exactly like we were talking about. We've got our users and our roles. So let's add, we were adding into the Beard audit database, we were adding Joey. So let's find Joey. And let's give him data reader roles. So we can save that. We do need to close our Excel sheet before we push it up. And now, if we, where are we? We're in the wrong place. So if we slowing this up, oops. If we navigate to 01, Terraform, Elastic Pool, and we do status. See, we've got something there. So we'll do a git add dot. We'll add our Excel sheet, and then we'll do a git commit -m, and Joey needs to read the audit DB for request 87521, and then we'll do a git push. Now, normally we would have started a new branch and done a PR, but I didn't want to show all of that. So we've pushed this up, and then we will go to our pipelines. We have a look at our pipelines, and you can see that our deploy permissions is already running. In fact, because I've done it as admin, I might just need to stop this one. Oh, that's under review. So we'll cancel that. And we will check this one. So this one will already be running. There we go. We're already adding our firewall rules, and then we're going to deploy our permissions. So this has already started running within seconds of us pushing up this code. We come back to here. And we were talking about the DBA team. The DBA team were like, well, okay, that looks okay. We can see how we can control those permissions with our Excel sheet. What happens if we really need to do something quickly? Well, that's okay. If you really need to do something quickly, you've got this PowerShell code. We'll just get all of our permissions, our secrets, our IDs out of Azure Key Vault, and then we can connect to a database. So we'll connect to Weird Audit. And then we can assign a user a permission. So our username is me. So let's just prove that. We'll have a look in the Beard Audit database as master, as SQL admin, because I can't show you otherwise. And we'll see there, I don't exist. Joey does, but not myself. So I'm going to be the username. And if I run this code, let's run it against the right database. We run this code. Excellent. It will work because you've done it on the wrong script, Rob. So let's put it in the right place. Always good to remember how your demos work when you're doing demos. Here we go. Going to run against Beard Audit. Here we go. So now you can see that we have added Rob Sewell to the DB owner role in the database Beard Audit. And if we go back to here and refresh our users, you can see that I have been added. There I am. I now exist. You can also see that our deploy script, has obviously been running because we've got users now in all of our roles. All of our database users have been applied. If we go back into our pipeline, we see we're still deploying our permissions. And whilst it's doing that, it's checking all of the code. It's going to come through. It's now checking if our users. So we're checking if Monica Rathburn should be in this role. All good. She does not exist. Checking Joey. Yep, this is good. Does not exist. And hopefully in a minute, we're going to, as it pops through, we're going to see that it should see that I've been added to the Beard Audit database. And what it will do is it will remove me from this pipeline. This is a really neat way of controlling our permissions within Azure SQL DB using Azure DevOps. We're in complete control. Everything is audited. We can go back through the history of our pipeline and we can see why these permissions were done. We could also remove all of the responsibility from the people. Other than the approvals, which are required, the actual applying the permissions was hands-off. The DBA team didn't have to worry about dealing with these tickets anymore. They literally went away from their workload. And all they would have to do is just do an approval on a pipeline, and that was it. It was all completed. So as with all good things in Azure, sometimes they take just a little bit longer than you have to talk, which is awesome, of course. And what we've got, let's see what we've got. Have we managed to get through to here yet? No, I still exist. We come back to our pipeline. See, it's still running through. Normally at this point, if we were in person or if this was live, I would be asking, hey, does anybody have any questions? But as that isn't possible, what I'm going to say is, look, if you have questions, then what you need to do is just get in touch with me. Here are my details. Twitter is the best way of getting in touch with me because I've normally got it. So SQL DBA with beard is where you should go. Come on, can we please have this finished? That would be awesome if we could get down to the bottom and find that we've got our permissions and I've been removed. Normally when I do these demos, I've done it a few times now, it finishes in about 5.5 minutes. So it doesn't take very long to run. And this was always my point with the DBA team is, look, if you can add a permission within 5-10 minutes, then why do we need another way to be able to do this? Right, so we've checked our users in our databases, and there we go. Excellent. So now you can see down at the bottom, it is removing me from the Beard Audit database. So even though as an admin, I could run the PowerShell script, which had permissions to go to the key vault and get the SPN secret and ID and run the code to be able to add myself to the audit database. As next time that the pipeline ran, it has removed me, and also it left a log here. So here is something saying, yeah, here we go. This person was there, but they were removed by the code. So why was that? What happened? Gives you something to look for. And it's quite easy to spot in the logs that somebody has been dropped. Okay. Thank you very much. I hope you have enjoyed my presentation. It's a nice, simple way of setting up an Excel managed permissions process for Azure SQL DB. And if you would like to find the code, all of my presentations can be found at beard.media/presentations. That's going to take you to my GitHub repository. You know that we're in the year 2021. I know it might still feel like 2020, but in that folder, you will find this PowerPoint and also the code that I have used to create all of this. Thank you very much.